A Sunday evening like any other in small-town America, the kind of night where nothing bad is supposed. To October 22nd, 1989, Street Joseph, Minnesota. A Sunday evening like any other in small-town America, the kind of night where nothing bad is supposed to happen. Jacob Wetterling was 11 years old, smart, kind, the type of kid who looked out for his younger brother and made friends easily. That night, he was hanging out at home with his 10-year-old brother Trevor and their friend, Aaron Larson, also 11. The plan was simple. Ride their bikes down to Tom Thumb, the local convenience store about a mile away, and rent a video. Maybe grab some candy. Be back before it got too late. It was the kind of freedom kids had back then, especially in a place like Street Joseph. Population barely over 4,000. The kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other by name, where parents didn't think twice about letting their kids ride bikes after dark. Patty and Jerry Wetterling gave the boys permission. Why wouldn't they? It was a short trip. The roads were quiet. Jacob was responsible. So, around 9 p.m., as the sun dipped below the horizon and the October air turned crisp, the three boys grabbed their bikes and headed out into the night. Jacob wore a red hockey jacket, his favorite. Trevor had on a blue jacket. Aaron, bundled up against the chill, rode alongside them. They pedaled down the long gravel driveway, turned onto the road, and disappeared into the darkness. None of them knew that in less than an hour, their lives and the lives of everyone in that quiet town would be shattered forever. Because someone was waiting, someone who had been watching, someone who had done this before. The ride to Tom Thumb should have been uneventful. Jacob, Trevor, and Aaron pedaled along the quiet rural roads, their bike tires crunching over gravel, their breath visible in the cold October air. The kind of ride where you talk about nothing and everything. School, hockey, whatever video they were going to rent. Street Joseph wasn't the kind of place where you worried. There were no streetlights lining every corner, no constant hum of traffic. Just open fields, scattered houses, and the occasional car passing by. The darkness felt normal, safe even. The route was familiar. They'd made this trip before. Down their long driveway, onto Kiwi Court, then a left onto 91st Avenue, less than a mile to the store. Easy. As they rode, the woods pressed in on either side of the road. Tall trees, their branches bare and skeletal against the night sky. The wind rustled through the leaves, still clinging to the ground. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that swallows sound. But the boys didn't notice. They were just kids on bikes, doing what kids do. They reached Tom Thumb around 9:15 p.m. The fluorescent lights inside the store felt warm and bright compared to the darkness outside. They browsed the video rental section, picked out a movie, paid, and stuffed it into a bag. The whole stop took maybe 10 minutes. By 9:30 p.m., they were back on their bikes, heading home. The return trip started the same way the ride there had, easy, unremarkable. They pedaled back down the same roads, retracing their path through the darkness. But this time, something was different. This time, they weren't alone. Somewhere along that stretch of road, in the shadows between the trees, someone was waiting. Someone who had been watching the area. Someone who knew the roads were empty, the houses spread far apart, the chances of being seen almost zero. The boys didn't see him yet. They were too busy pedaling, too focused on getting home, too wrapped up in their own conversation to notice the figure standing just off the road, hidden in the darkness. They rode past the driveway to the Rassier farm, a long, tree-lined driveway that disappeared into the woods. Just a little further and they'd be home. But they never made it. Because as they approached the intersection of 91st Avenue and Kiwi Court, a man stepped out of the shadows. And everything changed. It happened fast. One moment, the boys were pedaling home, their bikes cutting through the cold October night. The next, a voice shattered the silence. "Stop right there." The boys froze. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a mask. In his hand, something that made their blood run cold. A gun. "I have a gun," the man said, his voice low and commanding. "Get off your bikes, now." Jacob, Trevor, and Aaron didn't move at first. Their minds couldn't process what was happening. This was Street Joseph. This was their neighborhood. Things like this didn't happen here. But the man stepped closer, and the reality hit them like a punch to the gut. This was real. I said get off your bikes, the man barked. The boys obeyed, their hands trembling as they dropped their bikes onto the gravel road. The sound of metal hitting the ground echoed in the stillness. Lie down in the ditch, the man ordered. Face down. Don't look at me. The three boys stumbled toward the ditch on the side of the road, their legs barely able to hold them up. They dropped to the ground, pressing their faces into the cold, damp earth. The smell of dirt and dead leaves filled their nostrils. Their hearts pounded so hard they could hear the blood rushing in their ears. Trevor's mind was racing. This can't be happening. This can't be real. Aaron was shaking uncontrollably, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Jacob lay still, trying to stay calm, trying to think of a way out. The man stood over them, his flashlight beam sweeping across their bodies. How old are you? He demanded. Trevor's voice cracked as he answered. 10. You? The man pointed the flashlight at Aaron. 11, Aaron whispered. Then the beam landed on Jacob. How old are you? Jacob's voice was steady, despite the terror coursing through him. 11. There was a pause. A long, agonizing pause, where the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the boys' ragged breathing. Then the man spoke again. You too, he said, gesturing to Trevor and Aaron. Run into the woods. Don't look back. Don't turn around. If you look back, I'll shoot. Trevor's heart stopped. He didn't understand. Why were they being told to run? What about Jacob? Go, the man shouted. Trevor and Aaron scrambled to their feet, their legs shaking so badly they could barely stand. They stumbled toward the woods, their minds screaming at them to run faster, to get away, to survive. But as they ran, Trevor couldn't help it. He glanced back, just for a second, just long enough to see the man grabbing Jacob by the arm, just long enough to see his brother being pulled into the darkness. And then they were gone. Trevor and Aaron ran harder, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at their faces, their lungs burning. They didn't stop. They couldn't stop. The man's words echoed in their heads. If you look back, I'll shoot. They ran until their legs gave out. They ran until they couldn't hear anything but their own gasping breaths. They ran until they reached the edge of the woods and saw the lights of a house in the distance. And then they ran toward home. Behind them, the road was silent. Jacob was gone. The man had vanished into the night, taking an 11-year-old boy with him. No witnesses, no screams, no trace. Just 3 abandoned bikes lying in the gravel and a flashlight beam that had disappeared into the darkness. In that moment, everything changed. For Trevor and Aaron, childhood ended. The safety they had always known, the freedom they had taken for granted, it was ripped away in an instant. For the Wetterling family, a nightmare was just beginning. And for the town of St. Joseph, Minnesota, the world would never feel safe again. Because on that quiet autumn night, evil had walked among them, and it had taken one of their own. What would you have done in that moment? Let me know in the comments. Trevor and Aaron burst through the door of the Wetterling home, gasping for air, their faces pale with terror. Patty Wetterling looked up from the living room, her heart immediately sinking at the sight of them. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Where's Jacob? She asked, her voice tight with rising panic. Trevor could barely get the words out. His whole body was shaking, tears streaming down his face. A man with a gun. He took Jacob. For a moment, time stopped. Patty stared at her son, her mind refusing to process what she'd just heard. Jerry Wetterling appeared from another room, his face etched with confusion and fear. What? What are you talking about? Jerry demanded. Aaron was sobbing now, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. There was a man. He had a mask. He made us lie down. He had a gun. He told us to run. He took Jacob. He took him. The room spun. Patty felt her legs go weak. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not in St. Joseph. Not to Jacob. But the terror in Trevor's eyes told her everything she needed to know. This was real. Jerry grabbed the phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling as he pressed the buttons. My son's been abducted, he said, his voice cracking. Someone took my son. The dispatcher's voice came through, calm and professional, asking for details. Where? When? What did the man look like? Jerry relayed everything Trevor and Aaron were telling him. The masked man, the gun, the ditch, the woods. The location. near the intersection of 91st Avenue and Kiwi Court. "We need help now," Jerry said, his voice breaking. "Please, my son is out there." Patty pulled Trevor and Aaron close, trying to comfort them, even as her own world was collapsing. She could see the guilt and fear written all over Trevor's face. He was blaming himself. She could feel it. "It's not your fault," she whispered, holding him tight. "It's not your fault, Trevor." But Trevor couldn't stop shaking. He kept replaying the moment in his head, the man's voice, the flashlight, the sound of Jacob being pulled away. He should have done something. He should have fought back. He should have... "The police are on their way," Jerry said, hanging up the phone. His face was ashen. "They're coming." Minutes felt like hours. Patty paced the living room, her mind racing. Where was Jacob? Was he hurt? Was he scared? Was he calling for her? She wanted to run out into the night, to search every inch of those woods, to scream his name until her voice gave out. But she forced herself to stay calm. The police were coming. They would find him. They had to find him. Within minutes, the first squad car arrived, its lights flashing red and blue against the darkness. Then another, and another. Stearns County Sheriff's deputies flooded the scene, their radios crackling with urgent chatter. Flashlights swept across the road, the ditches, the tree line. Officers immediately began interviewing Trevor and Aaron, asking them to recount every detail. What did the man look like? How tall was he? What was he wearing? What did his voice sound like? The boys did their best, but their memories were fragmented, clouded by fear. The man had been wearing a mask, maybe a stocking, maybe something else. Dark clothing. He was taller than them, but they couldn't say exactly how tall. His voice was deep, commanding. And the gun. They remembered the gun. K-9 units arrived, their German shepherds straining at their leashes, noses to the ground. The dogs picked up a scent near the abduction site and followed it into the woods, but after a short distance, the trail went cold. Tire tracks were found on a nearby dirt road. Shoe prints in the ditch, but no Jacob. Search teams fanned out across the area, combing through fields, checking abandoned buildings, knocking on doors. Volunteers from the community began arriving, neighbors, friends, people who had heard the news and couldn't just sit at home. By midnight, dozens of people were searching. By dawn, it was hundreds. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. Roadblocks were set up on every major route out of town. Officers stopped cars, checked trunks, asked drivers if they'd seen anything unusual. But there was nothing, no sign of Jacob, no sign of the man who took him. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Patty stood in her driveway, wrapped in a blanket, watching the chaos unfold around her. Her mind kept drifting back to Jacob's room, his bed, still unmade from that morning, his hockey gear in the corner, his schoolbooks on the desk. He was supposed to be home by now. He was supposed to be safe, but he wasn't. And with every passing hour, the knot of fear in her chest grew tighter. The FBI was notified. Special agents were dispatched to Street Joseph. This was no longer just a local case. This was a child abduction, a federal crime. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the Wetterling home had become command central. Law enforcement officials filled the living room, setting up phone lines in case a ransom call came in. Victim advocates arrived to support the family. Media vans began lining the street. The story was spreading fast. A boy had been taken at gunpoint in rural Minnesota. An 11-year-old kid snatched off the street while riding his bike home. Parents across the state, across the country, felt a chill run down their spines. If it could happen in Street Joseph, it could happen anywhere. Patty Wetterling stood in front of the cameras for the first time that Monday afternoon, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Please," she said, looking directly into the lens. "If you have Jacob, please bring him home. He's just a little boy. He needs his family. Please." Her words echoed across the nation, but there was no response. No ransom demand, no phone call, no clue, just silence. And as the hours turned into days, one terrifying truth became impossible to ignore. Jacob Wetterling had disappeared without a trace, and no one knew if they would ever see him again. What's the weather like, where you are right now? Let me know below. The first 48 hours after a child goes missing are critical. Every investigator knows this. Every parent dreads it. Because if a child isn't found within that window, the chances of bringing them home alive drop dramatically. For the Wetterling family, those 48 hours were a blur of fear, hope, and crushing uncertainty. By Monday morning, less than 12 hours after Jacob's abduction, the town of St. Joseph had transformed into a massive search operation. Volunteers poured in from every direction. Farmers left their fields. Teachers called in sick. Store owners closed their shops and joined the effort. People who had never met the Wetterlings showed up with thermoses of coffee, sandwiches, and a desperate need to help. Because this wasn't just about one family anymore. This was about every family. Search teams were organized into grids, each assigned a specific area to cover. They walked shoulder to shoulder through cornfields, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign, a piece of clothing, a shoe, anything that might lead them to Jacob. They searched barns, sheds, abandoned houses. They waded through creeks and ponds, checked culverts and drainage ditches. They called Jacob's name until their voices went hoarse, but there was nothing. The woods near the abduction site were combed inch by inch. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their handlers watching for any signal that the search had turned from rescue to recovery. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the fear was there, lurking in the back of everyone's mind. What if Jacob is already dead? Patty refused to let herself think that way. She couldn't. If she allowed that thought to take root, she would collapse. So she focused on what she could control, keeping Trevor and Aaron safe, answering investigators' questions, and holding on to hope. Jerry was a wreck. He barely slept, barely ate. He spent hours walking the roads near the abduction site, retracing the route the boys had taken, as if somehow he could will Jacob back into existence. The Wetterling home became a hub of activity. FBI agents set up equipment to trace any incoming calls. Victim advocates worked with the family to prepare public statements. Psychologists were brought in to help Trevor and Aaron process the trauma. Trevor, especially, was struggling. He kept replaying that night over and over in his head. The man's voice, the gun. The moment he looked back and saw Jacob being taken. He felt like he should have done something. Fought back, screamed louder, refused to leave his brother. But he was 10 years old, and he had been terrified. Patty held him every time. The guilt overwhelmed him, whispering the same words over and over. "It's not your fault. You did nothing wrong." But Trevor didn't believe her. Aaron was haunted too. He stopped sleeping through the night. Every sound made him jump. He couldn't close his eyes without seeing the masked man, without hearing that voice. "Run. Don't look back." The two boys gave statement after statement to investigators, describing every detail they could remember. Forensic sketch artists worked with them to create a composite image of the abductor. The result was chilling. A rough sketch of a man in a mask, his features obscured, his eyes cold and empty. The sketch was released to the public on Tuesday, October 24th, just 2 days after the abduction. It was plastered on every news station, every newspaper, every bulletin board in the state. "Have you seen this man?" the caption read. "If you have any information about the abduction of Jacob Wetterling, please call the tip line immediately." The phones started ringing, and they didn't stop. Tips poured in from across Minnesota, then from neighboring states, then from across the country. People reported suspicious vehicles, strange men lurking near schools, anyone who remotely fit the description. Every single tip had to be followed up. Every lead had to be investigated. Detectives worked around the clock, interviewing potential witnesses, tracking down suspects, running background checks. The Stearns County Sheriff's Office had never handled a case of this magnitude. They were overwhelmed. The FBI stepped in to coordinate the effort, bringing in additional resources and expertise. Special agents trained in child abduction cases took over the investigation, working alongside local law enforcement. Roadblocks remained in place. Officers stopped every car, checked every trunk, asked every driver the same questions. "Where were you Sunday night? Did you see anything unusual?" Most people were cooperative, eager to help, but some were defensive, annoyed at being stopped and questioned. One man, pulled over at a roadblock on Highway 75, became belligerent when officers asked to search his vehicle. "You got a warrant?" he snapped. The officers didn't. But his reaction raised red flags. They took down his information, ran his plates, and added him to the growing list of persons of interest. There were dozens of names on that list, men with prior convictions for sex offenses, men who had been seen in the area around the time of the abduction, men who fit the general description Trevor and Aaron had provided. Each one had to be tracked down, interviewed, and cleared or investigated further. It was painstaking work, and with every hour that passed, the urgency grew. By Tuesday evening, 48 hours after Jacob's abduction, the search had expanded to cover over 100 square miles. Helicopters continued to sweep the area, their thermal imaging cameras scanning for any heat signature that might indicate a body alive or dead. Divers were brought in to search nearby lakes and ponds. Boats dragged the bottoms of rivers. Searchers on horseback covered terrain that was too rough for vehicles. And still, nothing. No clothing. No footprints. No sign that Jacob had ever been there. It was as if he had been erased from existence. The media coverage intensified. Local news stations ran continuous updates. National networks picked up the story. Jacob's face appeared on television screens across America, a smiling school photo, his eyes bright and full of life. 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling, abducted at gunpoint in rural Minnesota, the anchors reported. Authorities are asking anyone with information to come forward. The story struck a nerve. Parents everywhere felt a visceral fear. If a child could be taken at gunpoint in a small town like St. Joseph, then nowhere was safe. Playgrounds emptied. Kids were no longer allowed to walk to school alone. Bicycles sat unused in garages. The sense of innocence that had defined small-town America was shattered, and at the center of it all was a family in agony, waiting for answers that wouldn't come. On Wednesday morning, 72 hours after the abduction, Patty Wetterling stood in front of the cameras again. Her face was drawn, her eyes red from crying, but her voice was strong. "Jacob, if you can hear me, we love you," she said. "We're doing everything we can to bring you home. Don't give up. We won't give up." She turned to the camera, addressing the abductor directly. "And to the person who took my son, please let him go. He's just a child. He has a family who loves him. Whatever your reasons, whatever you're thinking, please, bring him back to us." Her plea was broadcast across the nation, but there was no response. No phone call, no ransom demand, no sign of Jacob, just silence. And as the first 48 hours came and went, the grim reality began to set in. Jacob Wetterling was still missing, and the chances of finding him alive were slipping away. If this story is hitting you hard, hit that like button. It helps more people hear Jacob's story. January 13th, 1989. 9 months before Jacob Wetterling was abducted. Cold Spring, Minnesota, a small town just 10 miles from St. Joseph. It was a Friday night, and 12-year-old Jared Shirel was leaving a community event at the local recreation center. His mom was supposed to pick him up, but she was running a few minutes late. Jared decided to wait outside. That's when a car pulled up. A man rolled down the window and asked Jared for directions. The boy stepped closer, trying to be helpful. Before he could react, the man lunged out of the car, grabbed him, and shoved him inside. Jared tried to fight back, tried to scream, but the man was too strong. He drove Jared to a secluded area, assaulted him, and then inexplicably let him go. "Don't tell anyone," the man warned. "If you do, I'll come back for you." Jared stumbled out of the car, disoriented and terrified. The man drove off into the night. Jared made it to a nearby business and called for help. Police arrived within minutes. An ambulance took him to the hospital. Evidence was collected: a rape kit, clothing samples, anything that might help identify the attacker. Jared gave investigators a description: a man in his 30s or 40s, average height, wearing a mask. He had been driving a dark-colored car, possibly a sedan. A composite sketch was created. Tips were called in. Suspects were questioned. But no arrest was ever made. The case went cold. And 9 months later, Jacob Wetterling disappeared under strikingly similar circumstances. A masked man, a rural area, nighttime, a child targeted seemingly at random. The parallels were impossible to ignore, or at least, they should have been. But in the chaos of the Jacob Wetterling investigation, the connection wasn't made, not officially, not right away. The two cases were handled by different jurisdictions. Cold Spring was in a different county. The investigators didn't communicate. The dots weren't connected. It was a failure that would haunt the investigation for decades. Because if the cases had been linked early on, if the evidence from Jared's assault had been compared to the evidence from Jacob's abduction, the investigation might have taken a very different path. But it didn't. Jared's case remained separate, buried in the files of the Cold Spring Police Department, and Jacob's case continued to spiral into frustration and dead ends. It wasn't until years later, that investigators began to seriously consider the possibility that the two crimes were connected. By then, crucial time had been lost, memories had faded, evidence had degraded, suspects had moved on, disappeared, or died. But the connection was real, and it would eventually become the key to solving Jacob's case. Jared Shirel never forgot what happened to him that night in January 1989. How could he? The trauma stayed with him, a shadow that followed him into adulthood. He heard about Jacob's abduction when it happened. He saw the news reports, the search efforts, the family's pleas, and something in his gut told him the cases were related. He reached out to investigators, telling them about his own assault, about the similarities, but his information was filed away, noted but not prioritized. It would be years before anyone took a serious look at the connection. In the meantime, Jared tried to move on with his life. He went to school, graduated, got a job, but the fear never fully left him. He looked over his shoulder constantly, wondering if the man who had attacked him was still out there, still hunting. He was. The man who assaulted Jared Shirel in January 1989 was the same man who abducted Jacob Wetterling in October 1989, and he had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. His name had come up early in the investigation. He had been questioned. His property had been searched, but he had lied. He had covered his tracks. And investigators, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of tips and suspects, had moved on. It was a mistake that would cost Jacob his life. And it was a mistake that would take nearly 3 decades to correct. But in 1989, no one knew that yet. All they knew was that a boy was missing, and the leads were drying up. The Jared Shirel case remained a footnote, a tragic but separate incident that didn't seem to fit into the larger puzzle. Except it did. It fit perfectly, and if investigators had realized that sooner, everything might have been different. But they didn't. And so the years dragged on, with Jacob's family waiting for answers that seemed like they would never come. The overlooked connection sat in the files, waiting to be discovered, waiting for someone to finally see what had been there all along. Did you catch that detail? Comment if you think the cases were connected. Moving forward. Section 9 coming up. Time has a strange way of moving when you're waiting for answers that never come. For the Wetterling family, every day felt like an eternity. And yet, somehow, the years slipped by. 1 year became 2, 2 became 5, 5 became 10. And still, no Jacob. His bedroom remained exactly as he had left it that October night in 1989. His bed, still unmade. His hockey posters on the walls. His school books stacked on the desk. Homework assignments he would never complete. Patty couldn't bring herself to change anything. To pack away his clothes, to take down his posters, it would feel like giving up, like admitting he was never coming home. So the room stayed frozen in time, a shrine to a boy who had been stolen from the world. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone that Jacob missed was another wound that never healed. Trevor grew up carrying the weight of that night. He graduated high school, went to college, built a life, but the guilt never left him. He had been there. He had seen the man take his brother, and no matter how many times his mother told him it wasn't his fault, a part of him would always wonder if he could have done something different. Aaron Larson struggled too. He moved away from Street Joseph eventually, trying to escape the memories. But you can't outrun trauma. It follows you, no matter how far you go. The Wetterling family became advocates, pouring their grief into action. The Jacob Wetterling Foundation grew into a national organization, pushing for legislative changes that would protect children and hold predators accountable. Patty testified before Congress. She met with lawmakers, with law enforcement officials, with other families who had lost children to violence and abduction, and slowly, the laws began to change. In 1994, 5 years after Jacob's abduction, Congress passed the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act. It was a landmark piece of legislation, the first federal law requiring states to create registries of sex offenders, making it easier for law enforcement to track predators and prevent future crimes. It was a victory, a meaningful, tangible change that would protect countless children. But it didn't bring Jacob home. Patty stood at the podium when the law was signed, her face a mixture of pride and heartbreak. "This is for Jacob," she said, her voice steady, "and for every child who deserves to grow up safe." But inside, she was screaming, because all the laws in the world couldn't undo what had been done. They couldn't bring back the boy she had lost. The years continued to pass. The case remained open, but the active investigation had slowed to a crawl. Detectives still followed up on tips when they came in, but they were few and far between now. The media moved on to other stories. The public's attention shifted. Jacob's face, once plastered on every news station and milk carton in America, began to fade from collective memory. But the Wetterling family never forgot. Every October 22nd, they held a vigil. Candles were lit, prayers were said, and Patty would stand before the small crowd of supporters and say the same thing she had said every year since 1989. "We will never stop looking for Jacob. We will never stop hoping. And we will never give up." The vigils grew smaller over the years. Fewer people attended. Life moved on for everyone else. But not for the Wetterlings. For them, time had stopped on that October night in 1989. Behind the scenes, advances in forensic science offered glimmers of hope. DNA technology had improved dramatically since the late 1980s. What had once been impossible, extracting usable DNA from degraded or minimal samples, was now routine. Cold case units across the country were reopening old investigations, using new technology to solve crimes that had been unsolvable decades earlier. The Wetterling case was no exception. In the early 2000s, investigators revisited the evidence that had been collected from the abduction site: tire tracks, shoe prints, fabric fibers. They also took another look at the Jared Shile case. DNA had been collected from Jared's assault in 1989, a rape kit that had been stored in evidence for over a decade. Now, with advances in DNA analysis, that evidence could finally be tested properly. The results were entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database that allows law enforcement to compare DNA profiles from different cases. And that's when things started to shift. The DNA from Jared's assault didn't match anyone in the system, but it was now on file, waiting for a match. If the person who assaulted Jared was ever arrested for another crime, if their DNA was ever collected and entered into the database, the system would flag it. It was a long shot, but it was something. Investigators also began to take a harder look at the connection between Jared's case and Jacob's. The similarities were undeniable. The timeline fit. The geographic proximity was striking. Could the same person be responsible for both crimes? It seemed likely. But without physical evidence linking the two cases, it was still just a theory. Still, it was a theory worth pursuing. In 2010, more than 20 years after Jacob's abduction, a new team of investigators was assigned to the case. Fresh eyes, new perspectives, a determination to find answers, no matter how long it took. They started from scratch, reviewing every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every tip that had ever been called in. They re-interviewed suspects who had been cleared years earlier. They used new technology to analyze old evidence. They looked for patterns, connections, anything that might have been missed the first time around. And slowly, painstakingly, they began to piece together a picture. A picture that pointed to someone who had been there all along. Someone who had been questioned early in the investigation. Someone whose name had come up again and again over the years. Someone who had managed to evade justice for nearly 3 decades. But the investigators were closing in. They didn't know it yet, but they were on the verge of a breakthrough. A breakthrough that would finally, after 27 years of silence, bring answers to the Wetterling family. And those answers would be more devastating than anyone could have imagined. We're about to get to the breakthrough. But first, subscribe if you haven't already. You'll want to see part 2. 26 years after Jacob Wetterling disappeared. A new team of investigators sat in a conference room at the Stearns County Sheriff's Office, surrounded by boxes of evidence, case files stacked floor to ceiling, and a whiteboard covered in names, dates, and connections. They had one mission: solve the Jacob Wetterling case. Leading the team was a seasoned FBI agent named Al Garber, along with investigators from the Stearns County Sheriff's Office and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. They knew this case inside and out. They had studied every report, every witness statement, every dead end that had frustrated investigators for decades, and they knew something that earlier investigators had missed, or at least hadn't fully pursued. The connection between Jacob's abduction and Jared Shire's assault wasn't just a theory anymore. It was the key to everything. The team started by re-examining the DNA evidence from Jared's 1,989 assault. The sample had been sitting in evidence for over 2 decades, but advances in forensic technology meant it could now be analyzed with far greater precision. They sent the sample to the lab for retesting, and they waited. While the DNA analysis was underway, investigators began revisiting the list of suspects who had been questioned over the years. There were hundreds of names. Some had been cleared definitively. Others had remained persons of interest, their involvement never fully ruled out. One name kept surfacing, again and again: Danny Heinrich. Heinrich was a local man, born and raised in the area. He had been in his mid-20s at the time of Jacob's abduction, living in Paynesville, Minnesota, a town just 30 miles from St. Joseph. He had been questioned early in the investigation. His name had come up because he fit the general profile: white male, the right age range, familiar with the area. But when investigators interviewed him in 1990, he had denied any involvement. He said he had been home the night Jacob was taken. He had no alibi, but there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime either. So he had been cleared, or at least moved to the back of the line. But now, in 2015, investigators were taking a second look, and what they found was disturbing. Heinrich had a history that had been overlooked, downplayed, or simply missed in the chaos of the original investigation. In 1990, just months after Jacob's abduction, Heinrich had been arrested on an unrelated charge: possession of child pornography. Federal agents had raided his home and found a massive collection of illegal images. He was convicted and sentenced to prison. But here's the thing: that arrest had happened after Jacob's case had already gone cold. And because Heinrich had already been questioned and cleared in Jacob's abduction, no one thought to revisit his involvement. It was a catastrophic oversight. Now, 25 years later, investigators were connecting the dots. Heinrich hadn't just been in the area when Jacob was abducted. He had been in the area when Jared Shire was assaulted too. In fact, Heinrich had lived in Paynesville in 1989, right between Cold Spring, where Jared was attacked, and St. Joseph, where Jacob was taken. The geographic connection was impossible to ignore, but there was more. Investigators began digging into Heinrich's background, looking for any other incidents that might be connected, and they found something that made their blood run cold. Between 1986 and 1987, there had been a series of attacks on boys in Paynesville, Heinrich's hometown. The attacks followed a disturbing pattern. A masked man would approach boys who were alone, often at night, and assault them. Sometimes he would let them go. Sometimes he would threaten them into silence. The attacks had stopped abruptly in 1987, and the case had never been solved. But the MO was strikingly similar to both Jared's assault and Jacob's abduction. Masked man, rural area, boys targeted at night. It all pointed to the same person, and that person was Danny Heinrich. Investigators now had a theory. Heinrich had been assaulting boys in Paynesville for years. When the heat got too intense, when police started investigating, he had stopped or moved his hunting ground. In January 1989, he had attacked Jared Shire in Cold Spring, and in October 1989, he had abducted Jacob Wetterling in St. Joseph. The pieces were falling into place, but they still needed proof. The DNA results came back from the lab. The sample from Jared's assault had been successfully retested, and the profile was clear. Now investigators needed a comparison sample. They needed Danny Heinrich's DNA. But Heinrich wasn't in custody. He had served his time for the child pornography conviction and had been released. He was living quietly, under the radar, in a small town in Minnesota. Investigators couldn't just walk up and demand a DNA sample. They needed probable cause. They needed a legal reason to compel him to provide it. So they started building a case. They obtained search warrants for Heinrich's property. They began surveillance, watching his movements, documenting his activities, and they waited for the right moment. In July 2015, investigators executed a search warrant on Heinrich's home. They were looking for anything that might connect him to Jacob's abduction: clothing, weapons, photographs, anything. What they found was damning. Heinrich's home was filled with evidence of his obsession with children. Thousands of images, videos, items that suggested he had been actively engaged in predatory behavior for decades. But there was no direct evidence linking him to Jacob. No clothing, no personal items, nothing that definitively placed him at the scene of the abduction. Still, investigators pressed on. They brought Heinrich in for questioning. He lawyered up immediately, refusing to answer questions. But investigators had one more card to play. They had the DNA from Jared's assault. And now, through the search warrant, they had obtained Heinrich's DNA. The samples were sent to the lab for comparison. And in the fall of 2015, the results came back. It was a match. Danny Heinrich's DNA matched the DNA from Jared Shire's 1,989 assault. After 26 years, investigators finally had their man. Heinrich was arrested and charged with child pornography offenses, charges that would carry a significant prison sentence. But investigators wanted more than that. They wanted answers about Jacob. They wanted to know what had happened that night in October 1989. They wanted to know where Jacob was. And they were willing to make a deal to get those answers. Federal prosecutors approached Heinrich's attorneys with an offer: plead guilty to the child pornography charges, and in exchange, tell us what happened to Jacob Wetterling. Heinrich's lawyers took the deal back to their client, and after weeks of negotiation, Heinrich agreed. He would confess. He would tell investigators everything, and he would lead them to Jacob. The Wetterling family was notified. After 27 years of waiting, of hoping, of fighting, they were finally going to get answers, but those answers would come at a price. Because what Danny Heinrich was about to reveal would shatter whatever hope remained that Jacob might still be alive. September 1st, 2016, 27 years after Jacob Wetterling vanished into the darkness. A convoy of law enforcement vehicles rolled down a rural road in Paynesville, Minnesota. FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, forensic teams, all following the directions of one man, Danny Heinrich. He sat in the back of an unmarked car, handcuffed, his face expressionless. He had agreed to show them where Jacob was. After nearly 3 decades of silence, he was finally going to tell the truth. The vehicle stopped near a farm field, miles from any main road. The area was remote, isolated, the kind of place where you could bury a secret and expect it to stay buried forever. Heinrich stepped out of the car, flanked by agents. He looked around, orienting himself, and then pointed toward a patch of ground near a grove of trees. "There," he said quietly. Investigators moved in with shovels, ground-penetrating radar, and cadaver dogs, and within hours, they found him. Jacob Wetterling, or what remained of him, buried in a shallow grave, his red hockey jacket still clinging to his bones. The boy who had been missing for 27 years had been there all along. Less than 30 miles from his home. Hidden in plain sight, Patty Wetterling received the call that afternoon, the call she had been waiting for since 1989. The call that confirmed what, deep down, she had always feared. Jacob was gone. He had been gone since that very first night. There would be no reunion, no miracle, no happy ending, just a grave in a field, and the unbearable weight of finally knowing. But the story didn't end there, because what Danny Heinrich confessed to what he revealed in the hours and days that followed was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. He didn't just take Jacob that night. He had been hunting for years. The boys in Paynesville, Jared Shire, and Jacob, all of them had been his victims. And the reason he had evaded justice for so long? The reason he had slipped through the cracks, even after being questioned early in the investigation? It was a failure of the system, a series of missed connections, overlooked evidence, and assumptions that allowed a predator to hide in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. Heinrich's confession would reveal the full scope of his crimes. It would expose the mistakes that had been made. And it would force a reckoning not just for the investigators who had missed the signs, but for a nation that had failed to protect its children. But that confession, the details of what happened to Jacob that night, the truth about how he died, and the systemic failures that allowed Heinrich to evade capture for so long, that's a story for part 2. Because this isn't just about one boy's abduction. It's about a mother's fight to change the laws that protect children across America. It's about the legacy Jacob left behind, a legacy that has saved countless lives. And it's about the painful, devastating truth that sometimes justice comes too late. In part 2, we'll reveal everything, the full confession. The moment Patty Wetterling faced her son's killer, the laws that were passed in Jacob's name, and how one family's unimaginable tragedy became a turning point in the fight to protect children. Part 2 drops soon. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Drop a comment if this story shook you. What time is it where you are right now? Let me know below. I'll see you in the next one.